The night was restless, the air thick with the scent of damp earth, as storm clouds loomed over the small village of Eldoria. A fierce wind rattled the wooden shutters of a modest hut where a woman lay sprawled on a tattered mat, her body drenched in sweat, her screams of agony swallowed by the raging storm outside. Inside, the flickering light of an oil lamp cast trembling shadows on the walls as Amara writhed in pain, her fingers clawing at the worn fabric beneath her. The old midwife, Mama Celia, knelt beside her, her weathered hands steady, despite the urgency of the moment. "Breathe, child," she urged. One more push. With one final cry, the newborn's wails sliced through the howling wind, a fragile but undeniable announcement of life. Mama Celia worked quickly, her experienced hands wrapping the tiny infant in a faded cloth. She smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "It's a girl," she said gently, holding the baby up for Amara to see. "A beautiful one." But Amara's body, weak from the strain, barely lifted from the mat. She turned her head, breathless, waiting for the rush of joy, the warmth of a mother's love to fill her chest. But something was wrong. The baby's cries were sharp, yet there was no spark in her gaze, no instinctive search for the mother's face. Mama Celia, sensing the unease, waved a hand slowly in front of the infant's eyes. No reaction. She tried again, this time snapping her fingers. The baby did not flinch. A deep sigh left the old woman's lips as she lowered her gaze to Amara. She does not see," Mama Celia murmured. Amara's breath hitched. The weight of those words pressed against her ribs, suffocating. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Mama Celia did not look away. "Your daughter is blind." The room spun. Amara's pulse pounded in her ears, her limbs frozen in disbelief. She stared at the tiny, innocent face, at the small hands grasping aimlessly at nothing. Outside, the village women who had gathered under the eaves of nearby huts waited eagerly for the news. Amara could already hear the whispers before they even began. "A cursed child, a bad omen. Who will marry a blind girl? She will bring suffering to her mother." Her body trembled, not from exhaustion, but from fear. She had already been abandoned once. The baby's father, Luca, had left months ago, vanishing into the city and never looking back. She had hoped, prayed that this child would be her salvation, her chance to rebuild, to be accepted again. But now, she was alone. That night, as the storm calmed and silence settled over the village, the tiny cries of the baby filled the small hut. Amara lay still, her face turned away, her mind unraveling. She knew what the village would say, what the elders would decide. She had seen it before. Children born with misfortunes were labeled as burdens, mothers shunned, left to fend for themselves. She could already picture the cold stares, the pitiful glances, the doors that would close in her face. Tears burned her eyes as she turned onto her side, watching the fragile bundle beside her. The baby whimpered softly, her tiny fingers curling and uncurling in the air, searching for comfort. Amara's heart clenched. She will suffer. That thought haunted her more than anything. More than the whispers, more than the judgment, more than her own shame. And so, before the first light of dawn kissed the sky, Amara made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The jungle was alive with the sounds of the night, crickets humming in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of an owl, the whisper of leaves shifting in the cold wind. The moon hung high, casting silver light through the canopy as Dr. Jonathan Reed urged his horse forward along the narrow path. He had been traveling for hours, returning from a neighboring village, where he had spent the last 3 days tending to the sick. Exhaustion weighed on his shoulders, but his mind remained sharp, trained by years of medical practice to always be alert. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the night, a cry, thin and desperate, rising above the symphony of the wild. Jonathan pulled on the reins, his horse snorting as it came to an abrupt stop. He listened, heart pounding, uncertain at first if he had imagined it. But there it was again, a wail small but urgent, like a plea cutting through the darkness. A child. Without hesitation, he turned his horse toward the sound, pushing deeper into the jungle. Branches clawed at his coat, the path uneven and treacherous, but he pressed on. The cries grew louder, raw with hunger and fear. Something in his chest twisted. Who would leave a child out here, in the middle of the night? Then he saw it. A tiny bundle, barely visible beneath the gnarled roots of an ancient tree. Jonathan slid off his horse, his boots sinking into the damp earth as he rushed forward. Kneeling, he carefully pulled back the thin, tattered cloth, revealing a newborn girl. Her skin was cold, her tiny hands trembling as she weakly kicked against the air. She was so small, so fragile. His throat tightened as he scooped her up, cradling her gently against his chest. "Who left you here, little one?" he whispered, rocking her instinctively. The baby let out another cry, as if answering him, her voice hoarse from screaming into the indifferent night. Jonathan checked her over, his practiced hands searching for any injuries. Malnourished? Yes. Weak, certainly. But she was alive. That alone felt like a miracle. He exhaled, holding her close as he stood. He had delivered enough children in his time to recognize that she could be no more than a few hours old. Whoever had left her here had done so with the intent of never returning. Anger stirred in his chest, but he pushed it down. There was no time for that now. His horse shifted restlessly, sensing his urgency. With careful movements, Jonathan climbed back into the saddle, adjusting the baby so she rested securely against him. "You're safe now," he murmured, stroking the top of her head as he turned the horse toward home. "I promise." The journey back was long, but Jonathan never let go. The baby's cries quieted, as if she could sense she was no longer alone, that she was no longer unwanted. By the time he reached the city, dawn was breaking, painting the sky in soft hues of gold and violet. The streets were still empty as he rode past silent houses, his destination clear. His home. The house was warm, the scent of burning wood lingering in the air, as Eleanor, his wife, sat by the fireplace, waiting. She had learned over the years that Jonathan's work often kept him away for days at a time, but something in her heart told her tonight had been different. When she heard the door creak open, she rose instantly. "Jonathan?" Her husband stepped into the light, his expression unreadable. But in his arms, wrapped in a cloth so thin it barely held warmth, was a baby. Eleanor gasped. "My God!" she whispered, rushing forward. Jonathan's voice was quiet, reverent. "Ours if she'll have us." Eleanor reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the baby's soft cheek. The child stirred but did not cry. It was as if she already knew this was home. Eleanor's eyes brimmed with tears. "What's her name?" Jonathan hesitated for only a moment before answering. Hope. Hope grew up surrounded by warmth, love, and the gentle guidance of the parents who had chosen her. Though she could not see the world, she experienced it in ways that others never could. The laughter of children in the streets, the rustling of the wind through the trees, the rhythmic footsteps of her father pacing his study, all these sounds painted a picture in her mind, clearer than any sight ever could. Eleanor devoted herself to teaching Hope how to navigate life without vision. She guided her small hands over the wooden table, showing her how to recognize different textures, how to tell fabrics apart by touch alone, how to pour a cup of tea without spilling a drop. Hope learned quickly, absorbing the world through the tips of her fingers, the soles of her feet, the vibrations in the air. By the time she was 5, she no longer needed assistance moving through the house. Every step, every doorway, every worn floorboard was imprinted in her memory. She walked with confidence, her head held high, never doubting where she was. Jonathan, too, played his part. While Eleanor taught her how to live, he taught her how to dream. He told her how to dream. He told her stories of faraway places, of vast oceans that stretched beyond the horizon, of mountains that touched the sky. He described the colors of the sunset, the golden fields that surrounded their home, the deep brown of Eleanor's eyes when she laughed, and Hope listened. She stored those colors in her heart, knowing she would never see them but feeling, somehow, that she already had. One evening, as Hope sat on the porch, listening to the rain, Eleanor came to sit beside her. In her hands, she held a small wooden case, the surface smooth from years of use. "Hope," she said softly, placing the case in her daughter's lap. "I have something for you." Hope's small fingers traced the edges, curiosity lighting up her face. "What is it?" Eleanor smiled, undoing the latch and guiding Hope's hands to the instrument inside. The wood was polished, cool beneath her fingertips, the strings taut and waiting. Hope ran her fingers along them, sensing something both fragile and powerful within the delicate frame. "It's a violin," Eleanor explained. "I want you to learn how to play." Hope hesitated, uncertain. "But I can't see the notes." Eleanor squeezed her hands gently. "You don't need to. Music isn't something you read with your eyes. It's something you feel with your heart." Hope held the violin closer, listening as Eleanor placed the bow in her hand, guiding it gently across the strings. A hesitant note filled the air, oft uncertain, then another and another. For the first time, Hope realized that sound could be more than just a way to understand the world. It could be something beautiful. From that night on, she practiced tirelessly, her fingers learning the violin as they had learned the world, by touch, by instinct, by listening to the way each sound resonated through her bones. At first, the notes were broken, sharp and unsure. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into years, she improved. Her music became an extension of herself, speaking in ways she could not. By the time she was 10, her melodies danced through the house, weaving their way into Jonathan's study, into Eleanor's kitchen, into Eleanor's kitchen, into the hearts of everyone who heard her play. Even those who passed by their home would pause, drawn to the haunting, beautiful sound. Some said it was magic, others said it was fate. Hope simply knew it was the truest part of herself, the part that needed no eyes to see, no vision to understand. She had been born into darkness, but she had learned to create light. One autumn evening, as the golden hues of dusk faded into deep indigo, Hope sat on the windowsill, her violin resting in her lap. The house was quiet except for the occasional rustle of paper from her father's study and the rhythmic clinking of dishes, in the kitchen where Elia was tidying up. The scent of warm bread still lingered in the air, wrapping around Hope like a familiar embrace. She loved these moments, the ones where silence held a gentle kind of music, a melody only she could hear. But that night, something felt different. She had noticed the hushed whispers between her parents lately, the way their voices would drop to a low murmur whenever she entered the room. She could sense the tension in their footsteps, the hesitation in their words. Hope had learned to read people, not with her eyes, but with everything else. The way they breathed, the way their hands moved, the way the air shifted around them. And tonight, she knew something was being kept from her. Curiosity gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside, lifting the violin to her chin. As soon as the bow touched the strings, the uncertainty faded, replaced by the steady comfort of sound. Music had always been her refuge, the place where she was never lost. Just as she let the notes carry her away, voices from her father's study drifted into the hall, low and urgent. "We need to tell her, Jonathan." Eleanor's voice was tight with worry. "I know," her father sighed, "weary, but not yet. She's not ready." Hope's bow faltered, the note breaking midair. Her heart pounded. "Tell her what?" "She deserves the truth," Eleanor pressed. "What if she finds out some other way?" Hope's grip on the violin tightened. The truth. What truth? She didn't even realize she had moved until she found herself outside her father's study, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The door was slightly ajar, and through the small gap she heard the words that shattered the world she thought she knew. "She wasn't born to us, Eleanor. We found her." Hope's breath hitched. "We saved her," Jonathan continued. "She was left in the forest, abandoned. Abandoned." The word felt like a blade slicing through her chest. Everything around her faded, the warm glow of the lamps, the creak of the old house, even the violin in her hand. None of it mattered, because suddenly she wasn't Hope, the beloved daughter of Jonathan and Eleanor Reed. She was someone else. Something else. Her heartbeat roared in her ears, drowning out the rest of their conversation. She stumbled back, her hands trembling as she clutched her violin, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. Abandoned. She had never questioned where she came from. Why would she? She had always felt safe, loved, protected, but now doubt coiled around her like vines, suffocating. Who had left her? And why? The urge to run, to escape the suffocating weight of the truth was overwhelming. But where would she go? She was blind. Where could she possibly go? Blind. And suddenly it made sense. Had that been the reason? Had she been left behind because she couldn't see? A tear slipped down her cheek, followed by another and another, until silent sobs shook her fragile frame. She turned and hurried back to her room, shutting the door behind her as though she could lock out the truth. Her parents had lied to her. Her life, the one she thought she had always known, was built on a secret. And now that secret had unraveled. She was lost. Hope didn't leave her room the next morning, or the morning after that. The house, once filled with her music, was now suffocatingly silent. Jonathan and Eleanor knocked on her door, their voices gentle, pleading, "Hope, sweetheart, please talk to us." But she didn't answer. She sat curled on the edge of her bed, her violin resting on her lap, untouched. It had always been her solace, her safe place. But now it felt like a lie, just like everything else. Her hands trembled as she traced the wooden frame, her mind replaying her father's words over and over and over and over and over. She was left in the forest, abandoned, abandoned. The word wouldn't leave her. It echoed in her chest, a wound that refused to close. She thought of the mother who had carried her, the one who had held her, if only for a moment, before deciding she wasn't worth keeping. Had she cried? Had she hesitated? Or had she simply walked away? The thought made Hope sick. She had always believed she was whole, that she belonged, but now she felt like a mistake, a child left behind because she wasn't enough. Her throat tightened. Jonathan and Eleanor weren't her real parents. They had loved her, yes, raised her, given her a home. She had trusted them, and they had lied. A sharp knock at the door made her flinch. She tensed, expecting another plea, another desperate attempt to pull her from the storm raging inside her. But this time her father's voice was different. Quiet, raw. "Hope," Jonathan murmured, his voice thick with emotion. For a moment, she almost did. But then the anger came, hot and blinding. "Go away," she snapped, her voice hoarse from disuse. Silence. Then a slow, heavy sigh, footsteps retreating down the hall. Hope let out a shaky breath, pressing her forehead against her knees. She couldn't stay here. Not now. Not when every room, every wall, every wall, every whisper reminded her of the life that had been built on a secret. That night, when the house was dark and quiet, Hope stood by the door, listening. She could hear Jonathan's deep, steady breathing from the other room, Eleanor's soft sighs as she turned in her sleep. Her parents. No, not parents. Not really. Her chest ached. She gripped her cane tightly and took a step forward. Then another. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to leave. She needed to find the woman who had abandoned her. And she needed to know why. The dusty road stretched endlessly before Amara, the heat of the midday sun pressing down on her weary shoulders. Her feet ached from days of walking, her throat dry from unanswered questions. She had been to countless villages, spoken to strangers who either dismissed her or pitied her, yet she pressed on. She had spent years trying to forget, years convincing herself that leaving her child behind had been the only way. But guilt was a cruel companion. It never truly left. It had followed her like a shadow, whispering in her ears when she lay awake at night, tightening its grip when she saw other mothers holding their children. And now she was here, searching for a child who might not even be alive. Please, she begged an elderly shopkeeper in a crowded market, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. Have you heard of a blind girl? She would be around 15 now. She was be around 15 now. She was abandoned. The man frowned, his fingers tightening around the basket of fruit he was arranging. A blind girl, he repeated, his voice cautious. Amara nodded desperately. The man exhaled, glancing over his shoulder as if searching for someone before lowering his voice. If it's the girl I think you mean, she's not blind anymore. Amara felt the breath leave her lungs. What? She plays the violin, the man continued, wiping his hands on a rag. I've never seen her, but they say she's a miracle. A doctor and his wife raised her after finding her in the forest, and now she plays like the angels themselves. Amara swayed on her feet, gripping the edge of the stall to steady herself. Her daughter was alive, not just alive. She had been loved, raised by another, given a life Amara had been too afraid to give her. And she could see. Tears blurred Amara's vision as she pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. Where is she? She whispered, her heart pounding. The shopkeeper hesitated, then nodded toward the northern road. The city, that's where you'll find her. Amara didn't waste another second. With renewed purpose, she turned and walked, then ran, ignoring the pain in her legs, the blisters on her feet. The journey ahead was long, but she didn't care. She would find her daughter, and this time she wouldn't let her go. Hope's fingers moved instinctively over the violin strings, her bow gliding smoothly as the haunting melody filled the air. She played with her eyes closed, not because she couldn't see. She could now bow because music had always been about feeling, not sight. The square was alive with the sounds of the city, vendors shouting their prices, horses' hooves clattering against cobblestone, the murmur of conversations blending into a steady hum. But all of it faded into the background as her song wove through the crowd, pulling listeners closer. She didn't know why she had come here today. Maybe it was the need to escape the silence of the house, the weight of her own thoughts. Ever since she had learned the truth, she had felt like a stranger in her own life. Jonathan and Eleanor, her parents, but not her parents. Home, but not home. And the woman who had left her. Who was she? Where was she? A sudden chill ran down her spine, an odd sensation like someone watching her from a distance. She had been used to this feeling when she was blind, sensing the weight of someone's presence, even when she couldn't see them. But now, with her vision restored, it felt different. She let the final note fade, lowering the violin as the crowd clapped. Some tossed coins into the small case at her feet, murmuring praises as they walked away. But one figure remained, standing motionless at the edge of the square. Hope's gaze landed on the woman, a stranger with tired eyes and trembling hands. Her clothes were worn from travel, dust clinging to the hem of her skirt. But it wasn't her appearance that made Hope's breath catch. It was the way she looked at her, with something raw, something almost desperate. Hope's heart pounded. The woman took a hesitant step forward, then another. She opened her mouth, but no words came at first. Then, barely above a whisper, "You are my daughter." The world tilted, the sounds of the square dulled, swallowed by the roaring in Hope's ears. She stared at the woman, unable to move, unable to speak. A stranger, but not a stranger. Her fingers clenched around the violin. She had dreamed of this moment, imagined it in countless ways. But now that it was here, she felt nothing like what she had expected. No rush of relief, no overwhelming joy, only confusion. Who? Who are you? Hope finally managed, her voice uncertain. Tears slipped down the woman's cheeks, her hands shaking. "I'm your mother," she said again, stronger this time. "I'm Amara, and I have been searching for you for years." Hope's stomach twisted. She wanted to run. She wanted to stay. She wanted the truth, and she wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. Hope's grip on her violin tightened, her breath unsteady as she stared at the woman standing before her. "My mother." The words echoed in her mind, unfamiliar and sharp, like a blade she wasn't sure how to hold. Amara took another hesitant step forward, her eyes searching Hope's face as if memorizing every detail. "I never stopped thinking about you," she whispered. "Not for a single day." Hope swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. The part of her that had spent sleepless nights wondering why she had been left behind, why she hadn't been wanted, demanded to hear more. But another part, the part that had been raised by Jonathan and Eleanor, the part that knew what it was like to be loved, recoiled. "You abandoned me." Her voice was quiet, but the accusation in it was deafening. Amara flinched, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "I did," she admitted, tears pooling in her eyes, "and I have lived with that guilt every day since." Hope felt a surge of anger, hot and unfamiliar. "Then why?" Her voice cracked. "Why did you leave me? Why was I not enough?" Amara let out a broken sob, pressing a hand to her mouth before speaking. "It was never about you," she said. "It was about me, my fear, my shame, the village. They saw you as a curse. They said you would bring ruin to my life, and she exhaled shakily. "I was weak. I let them get inside my head. I let their words poison me." Hope's nails dug into her palm. "So you chose them over me." "I chose wrong." Amara's voice cracked. "And I have paid for it every day since." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Hope wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that this woman, this stranger, had regretted her decision. But regret didn't erase the years of wondering, the nights spent questioning her worth. "I don't know what you want from me," Hope whispered. Amara took a slow breath. "I don't want to take you away from the family that raised you. I just want a chance. I just want a chance. A chance to know you, to tell you how sorry I am." Hope's chest ached, her mind a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't name. She had spent so long searching for answers, and now she wasn't sure if she wanted them at all. The weight of Amara's words lingered in Hope's chest long after she walked away. She had stood there, frozen, as her mother, her birth mother, had pleaded for understanding, for forgiveness, but Hope hadn't been able to give her either. That night, as she sat by the fireplace, the violin resting untouched beside her, Jonathan and Eleanor watched her with quiet concern. They hadn't pushed, hadn't pried, but Hope could feel their worry in the way her father's fingers tapped restlessly against the armrest of his chair, in the way Eleanor kept glancing at her, as though she might disappear. Finally, Jonathan spoke. "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready," he said softly. Hope hesitated, staring into the flickering flames. "I met her," she whispered. Eleanor's breath hitched. Jonathan sat forward, his jaw tightening, but he stayed silent. "She told me she regretted it," Hope continued, her voice hollow. "She said she thought she was cursed, that the village convinced her I would ruin her life." Eleanor let out a quiet, pained sigh. "Oh, sweetheart." Hope blinked, feeling the familiar sting of tears. "She wants to know me." The words felt heavy, too big for her to carry alone. "She says she doesn't want to take me away from you, but I don't know." She swallowed hard, gripping the edge of her skirt. "What if I don't want to know her?" Jonathan leaned forward, his voice steady but gentle. Hope's breath hitched as she turned toward him. "But what if I should? What if walking away makes me just as bad as she was?" Jonathan reached over, placing his warm, calloused hand over hers. "Hope," he said firmly, "choosing yourself is not the same as abandoning someone." Hope bit her lip, looking down at their joined hands. She had never questioned his love or Eleanor's. They had given her everything, even the truth, when it would have been easier to keep lying. But still, there was a small part of her that needed to understand. "There's something else," Jonathan continued, his voice careful. "Something we haven't told you yet." Hope's pulse quickened. "What?" Jonathan exchanged a glance with Eleanor before turning back to her. "Your blindness," he said. "It wasn't permanent." Hope's breath caught. "We found out when you were younger," Eleanor added, her voice thick with emotion. "There was a chance, a surgery that could restore your sight." Hope stared at them, her heart pounding. "And you didn't tell me." Jonathan exhaled. "We wanted to be sure. And when we were sure, we didn't want you to feel like you were broken. You were already whole to us." Hope's chest tightened. She remembered the way they had always encouraged her to embrace her world as it was, to trust her other senses, to live without limits. And yet deep down, a part of her had always wondered, what if? Now she knew. And now she had a choice. "Do you still have the money?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan hesitated, then nodded. "It's not about the money, Hope. It's about what you want." Hope closed her eyes, taking a slow, deep breath. For so long, she had been searching for answers, for truth, for herself. Maybe this was the first step toward finding it. "I want surgery." The hospital smelled of antiseptic and fresh linen, the air thick with quiet tension. Hope sat on the edge of the examination table, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she listened to the steady beeping of a heart monitor in the next room. The world around her felt too big, too overwhelming, and for the first time in a long time, she wished for the comforting darkness she had once known. Jonathan and Eleanor sat beside her, their presence steady, unwavering. Her father's hand rested on her shoulder, a silent promise that he was there no matter what happened. Eleanor had barely let go of her since they'd arrived, her fingers brushing Hope's arm every few minutes, as if to remind herself that this was real, that her little girl, her daughter, no matter what blood said, was about to step into a world she had never known. Dr. Whitmore, a kind-eyed surgeon with a voice like soft gravel, stood before them, flipping through a chart. "Your scans look good, Hope," he said, his tone reassuring. "Your optic nerves are intact. If all goes well, the surgery should restore your sight." Hope swallowed, her throat dry. "And if it doesn't?" Dr. Whitmore hesitated, then exhaled. "There's always a risk," he admitted. "But we wouldn't go through with it if I didn't believe there was a strong chance of success." Success. That word had never meant so much and yet scared her more than anything. For years, blindness had been her reality. The way she knew the world, the way she understood herself. And now, in a few short hours, that might change forever. Would she still be Hope if she could see? Her fingers grazed the worn wood of her violin case, resting beside her on the table. She had spent her whole life creating light through sound, filling her world with music instead of colors. What if she lost that part of herself? "Are you sure you want to do this, sweetheart?" Eleanor asked gently, squeezing her hand. Hope took a deep breath. No, she wasn't sure. She wasn't sure of anything anymore, except for one thing. She wanted to know. She wanted to see the people who had raised her. She wanted to see the sky she had only ever felt in the warmth of the sun against her skin. She wanted to look into a mirror and finally understand what it meant to be herself. She lifted her chin, steeling herself. "I want to do it." Jonathan exhaled softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We're right here," he whispered, "no matter what." A nurse entered the room, a kind smile on her face. "It's time." Hope's heart pounded as she lay back against the cold operating table. Machines beeped softly around her, the room buzzing with quiet preparation. The smell of disinfectant filled her nose, the lights above her a bright blur, even behind her closed eyelids. Dr. Whitmore's voice was calm. "We're going to count down from 10. Just relax, Hope." A cool sensation flowed through her veins as the anesthesia took hold. 10, 9, 8, 8. She thought of the mother who had left her, of the one who had saved her. 7, 6, 6. She thought of music, of the way the world had always felt instead of looked. 5, 4. She thought of a future she couldn't yet see. 3, 2, 1. Darkness. And then nothing. Hope drifted between dreams and emptiness, the weight of unconsciousness slowly lifting like a veil being drawn back from her mind. She felt warmth first, the gentle press of a hand over hers, the steady rhythm of fingers tracing soothing circles against her palm. Then came sound, the hushed whispers of voices, The occasional beeping of machines, the soft rustling of fabric as someone shifted beside her. Her body felt heavy, as if she were floating just beneath the surface of waking. The last thing she remembered was the countdown, the way her father's voice had lingered in her mind as everything faded. Now she was here. But where was here? A breathy exhale left her lips as she stirred, her fingers twitching beneath the weight of the hand holding hers. Ho! Eleanor's voice. Hope swallowed, her throat dry, her tongue thick in her mouth. She blinked, her lashes fluttering against her cheeks. Something felt different. The world behind her closed eyes wasn't the same kind of darkness she had known before. It wasn't the endless, familiar void she had spent her life navigating. There was something new there, something unfamiliar, something pressing against the edges of her vision, like light seeping through a crack in a door. Panic twisted in her chest. What if it hadn't worked? What if it had, and she wasn't ready? She sucked in a sharp breath, and Jonathan was there in an instant, his voice steady, grounding. Take your time, sweetheart, he murmured. We're here. Slowly, with a hesitance that made her heart pound, hope forced her eyelids to lift. At first, everything was a blur. The world swam before her, colors bleeding into one another, shapes shifting too fast for her to comprehend. She sucked in another breath, blinking rapidly, her fingers gripping Eleanor's hand like anchor. Then, slowly, painfully, things began to settle. A face. Not just a voice, not just warmth or presence, but a face, the first face she had ever seen. Eleanor's eyes were wet, wide and shimmering. Her hair, the one Hope had touched so many times, was dark, curling softly around her shoulders. And her smile, God, her smile, was everything Hope had ever imagined it to be. Tears welled up in Hope's own eyes, her breath catching in her throat. You! She choked on the word, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor let out a soft, broken laugh, pressing Hope's hand to her cheek. Oh, my love, she whispered. So are you. A sob tore through Hope's chest as she turned her head, her gaze landing on Jonathan. He looked exactly as she had pictured him. Strong, steady, warmth in his eyes that had never needed sight to be felt. He let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his graying hair as he smiled at her. Hey, kiddo. Hope let out a watery laugh, her heart aching with the weight of it all. For the first time in her life, she saw the people who had loved her before she had ever known them. The people who had chosen her. She looked down at her own hands, seeing them for the first time, familiar yet foreign. Her fingers trembled as she reached for Eleanor again, as if needing to confirm that this was real. And then her gaze shifted. Across the room near the doorway stood another figure. Amara. Hope's breath hitched. Her birth mother stood frozen, as if afraid to move, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her face, one that should have been familiar, yet wasn't, was lined with something raw, something desperate. Hope's chest tightened, emotions warring within her. For years, she had imagined this moment, wondered what it would feel like to see the woman who had left her. Now, here she was. and Hope didn't know what to feel at all. Hope's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths as she stared at the woman standing in the doorway. For years, she had dreamed of this moment, of what it would feel like to face the person who had abandoned her. She had imagined anger, bitterness, maybe even hatred. But now, as she looked at Amara, all she felt was uncertainty. Amara's hands trembled where they were clasped in front of her, her eyes wide, brimming with emotion. She took a cautious step forward, then hesitated. "You can see me," she whispered, her voice fragile, as if she were afraid speaking too loudly would shatter this moment. Hope swallowed hard. Yes, the single word carried so much weight. She could see her now. The woman who had given her life, who had left her in the forest all those years ago. Amara's face was worn with time, her dark hair streaked with silver, her features so much like Hope's own that it startled her. Her features so much like Hope's own that it startled her. She had always wondered if she looked like her. Now she knew. Jonathan and Eleanor remained silent beside her, giving her space to decide how this would go. Hope could feel Eleanor's fingers still gently gripping hers, a silent reminder that she was not alone. Amara took another step, her voice barely holding together. "Hope, I." She stopped, pressing a shaking hand to her mouth before taking a deep breath. "I have spent every day of my life regretting what I did to you." Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "There is no excuse for what I did, no way to erase the pain I caused you. But if there is even the smallest part of you that can forgive me, I am begging you to let me tell you how sorry I am." Hope's throat tightened. She didn't know if she could forgive her. She thought of the nights she had spent wondering why she had been unwanted, the pain of realizing she had been discarded like she was nothing, the doubt, the questions, the scars no one could see. But she also thought of Amara's face now, lined with grief, filled with the kind of regret that couldn't be faked, the kind of regret that had followed her for years, weighing her down. Hope took a slow, deep breath, letting the silence stretch between them. "I don't hate you," she said finally, her voice quieter than she expected. Amara let out a sharp breath, like she had been holding it in for years. "But you're right," Hope continued. "There's no way to erase what happened." Her fingers curled slightly in Eleanor's grasp. "And no matter what, they are my parents." She turned to Jonathan and Eleanor, their faces filled with quiet love, silent support. "They are the ones who raised me, who never left." Amara nodded quickly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know," she whispered. "I don't want to take you from them. I don't want to take you from them. I just needed to see you, to hear your voice, to know that you were okay." Hope exhaled slowly. "I am okay," she said, and for the first time, she truly meant it. Amara wiped at her tears with unsteady hands. "That's all I needed." She took a step back, her body shaking. "I won't ask for anything more." Hope hesitated, staring at the woman who had once been nothing more than a question mark in her life. "I can't promise that I'll ever see you as my mother," she admitted. "But I hope you find peace." Amara let out a quiet sob, nodding quickly. "Thank you," she whispered. "That is more than I deserve." She turned toward the door, her steps slow, as if she were memorizing the way Hope looked one last time. And then she was gone. The room fell silent, save for the quiet hum of the machines. Hope let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Jonathan squeezed her shoulder. Are you okay? Hope thought about it for a moment, then nodded. For so long, she had been searching for truth, for answers, for something to make her feel whole. And maybe she had finally found it. She turned to Eleanor, her lips curling into the softest smile. Can I see my violin? Eleanor beamed, reaching for the case beside the bed. Of course, my love. Hope ran her fingers over the familiar wood, the feel of it grounding her. She lifted the violin to her chin, closed her eyes, and drew the bow across the strings. The first note rang through the room, clear and steady. She no longer needed music to see. But she would never stop playing, because music had never been about vision. It had always been about feeling. Life lessons from Hope's story. Hope's journey teaches us a powerful truth. Family is not just about blood. It is about love, choice, and the people who stand by you when the world turns its back. Jonathan and Eleanor didn't give birth to Hope, but they chose to love her, to fight for her, and to give her a life filled with warmth and possibility. Their love was unconditional, proving that true parents are the ones who never leave, no matter the obstacles. At the same time, Amara's story reminds us that regret alone cannot undo the past. She learned the hardest lesson of all, that fear and shame can lead us to make terrible mistakes. But seeking forgiveness is the first step toward healing. While she could never reclaim the years lost, she found closure in knowing that her daughter had grown strong despite her absence. Hope herself teaches us resilience. She faced abandonment, identity struggles, and the fear of the unknown, yet she never allowed her past to define her future. Even with the chance to see, she realized that sight had never been her limitation. It was her heart, her courage, and her ability to feel that truly made her who she was. Ultimately, this story is about forgiveness, healing, and the power of second chances. It's about learning that while we can't change the past, we can choose how we move forward. What about you? What lessons did this story teach you? Let us know in the comments below. And before you go, tell us, where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories and turn on notifications so you never miss an update.